I'm holding a book that I believe will change the way you look at Bible prophecy. And here to discuss this book, which, by the way, is entitled Ancient Testaments of the Patriarchs, is its author, Dr. Ken Johnson. Ken, welcome back to Prophecy Watchers.
Thank you for having me back.
Always good to have you back, and it's always good to sit and read your latest book, because it's amazing. I don't know where you go or where you dig to find all these things, but you never disappoint, and we really appreciate you. You, by the way, have written how many books?
28.
20. So what are you doing in your spare time?
Write books.
Write books. Okay, I've got it. He's written a number of books. We'll talk about that later. This one, his latest, Ancient Testaments of the Patriarchs, begs a couple of explanations. First of all, how do you define patriarch?
Well, the Dead Sea Scroll community and the Talmudic community, the Pharisaical community, and the church fathers all basically taught this legend that the patriarchs, which is from Adam through Noah, down to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, down to Aaron, this whole lineage were prophets, and they wrote what was called testaments, which is like a small autobiography, and what they wanted their children to know. So some of these things are very, very personal, but they also contain theology and some amazing extra-biblical prophecy.
And so a testament can be essentially whatever someone wants or finds important in their own life.
Right.
And so as you read these testaments of the patriarchs, you're reading personal stuff. And I had no idea about this until I began to read your book. And let me just name a few names. Enos, Lamech, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, of course the 12 tribes, the patriarchs of the 12 tribes are in here. These are names that normally you associate with great biblical events, acts of God, and so forth and so on. But then when you look at their testaments, you're looking at personal experiences. You're looking at the way they looked at life, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, we're all human. We all have a sin nature and a problem side. And when God works with us, we have a side of grace, and some amazing things happen.
And by the way, as long ago as this was written, we can talk about how far back they go, they still spoke of grace.
Yes.
They didn't speak in terms of law so much, but the grace of God, which is amazing.
Yeah, the Dead Sea Scroll community actually talked about when the Messiah would come, he would create a new covenant. It would be called the Covenant of Grace. They looked for it for about 100 years.
Let's talk about the time of Christ, and because the way you explained it is fascinating to me. When Jesus came, the authorities who essentially ran the priesthood and ran the temple of Herod were, shall we say, not on the up and up. They had deviated drastically in many ways from the law, and when Jesus came, he wasted no time. He came in and turned over the tables of the money changers, and he began to lecture the Pharisees and the Sadducees, telling them how wrong they were. And when we read the Bible, we think of that, but we never think of what lay just to the east of the temple, namely the spiritual community of the Essenes, who were just as disgusted with the Pharisees and Sadducees as Jesus was.
Right.
And that's the setting, sort of, because the Essenes were the people who put all these libraries together and then stored them so that they would be found later.
Right.
And so you're looking really at an inside view of two different perspectives, the legalism and the grace of God and prophecy.
Right. Yeah, Josephus said that the Essenes were known to be extremely accurate in their prophecies. And when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the history that they teach is basically Jews were Jews until the time of the Hasmonean dynasty. And then there was, and it's greatly described exactly what happened, but it fragmented to Pharisees and Sadducees. And then the Pharisees kind of fragmented into Pharisees and Essenes. And the patriarchs from a long time back prophesied how the priests would corrupt, the temple would corrupt, and that the Messiah would come and be killed by the priesthood. And the Essene community, in their writings, actually said that the Holy Spirit wanted them to go back to Israel, not to go to the temple, not to do anything with sacrifices, not to even fellowship with the Pharisees or Sadducees, start a community and fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah about a voice crying in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. And they said that this would facilitate the coming of the Messiah, who would create a new covenant of grace. And that's what they were looking for.
Isn't it fascinating that the first huge find in the area of the Essenes was the Isaiah scroll that made such great news back in 1948? That was kind of a change point in human history, I think.
Yeah, I believe so. If you look at Isaiah chapter 29, he talks about the fact that God destroys the Jews and sends them out, which is the Roman expulsion. And then they're brought back, and they have this war with their neighbors. And during that time, the old ones begin to speak out of the dust of the earth. And Israel Yarden actually said that he went down to buy the very first scroll, and he bought it and couldn't come back because a war had started. Israel had declared independence. So it's interesting that Isaiah predicted the Dead Sea Scrolls coming back, which means we probably should pay attention to what they have to say.
I think so. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. This is not designed as a trick question. It may be tough, but if you had to pick out your very favorite part of this book, what is it?
Well, there's a couple of them. The moral issues and what happened is really amazing. Like the Talmud says that Amram divorced his wife, and that's not what happened according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. He went back to build the cave of the Patriarchs, and a war broke out between the Canaanites and the Philistines and the Egyptians. The border was sealed off, and he couldn't get back. He was without his family for 41 years. And he said that he never once thought about getting another wife or remarrying. He just wanted back with his love, his one true love. And some of the stuff in there is very heart-wrenching.
And that, by the way, that really touches on the point that I made a minute ago, that for me, when I read this, it's the first time I've ever been moved as you would be moved by a letter from, say, an uncle who lives 1,000 miles away and who really wants to open his heart and tell you what he is thinking. You read that letter and you're almost moved to tears. And that's the effect that these testimonies have.
Yeah, there's many testimonies like that in there that make you stop and go, whoa, should I really be reading this? This is really personal.
It is.
But then the prophecies are amazing too. Like they talk about the Messiah coming, and the Messiah saves us from our sin nature, reconciling us to God.
Right.
And the event, whatever he does to do this, actually happens on their calendar. They say it's at the end of the first Shemitah after the 9th Jubilee of their age. And when you go back and you calculate that, it comes out to 32 AD. So the Messiah is supposed to come and fix our problem in 32 AD.
Now, what a date.
Yeah.
In retrospect, we know what that date was.
We know exactly what that was.
Passover of AD 32.
Yes.
Now, that's absolutely amazing. And also, the Jubilees kind of came to an end at that point, right?
Yeah, we now know the exact biblical Jubilees, and we know the end of the ages as taught by Enoch in the School of the Prophets. So the end of the first 2 ages have already happened. We're getting close to the end of the second age. It's amazing the type of prophecies. There's a few end time, what we would call end time, second coming type prophecies. The fact that there will be a second coming and 2 separate comings of one Messiah, I thought was pretty fascinating. Whereas the Pharisees thought of 2 separate Messiahs. But there's a few of those in there, but mainly, most, I'd say 90% of the prophecies focus on the first coming.
You know how it is when you, maybe you read a book, maybe you're watching something, and you have a moment when you have a wow moment. Oh, goodness, I can't believe this. I had a wow moment. Page 142. And it's all about the prophecy of the Apostle Paul. Now, this is written by Benjamin, ostensibly. When would he have written this?
Well, all the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated around 100 to 150 BC. So that makes it not possible for a Christian to have doctored it up. According to them, they really believe these were the copies of the original writings. So Benjamin would have written that. So that would have been back at 14, 15, maybe 1600 BC.
Well, and I'm going to quote this on page 142 of Ken's book. And it says, Benjamin's writing these words, "I will no longer be called a ravening wolf on account of your ravages, but a worker of the Lord, distributing food to them that work what is good." Now, this is Benjamin writing. Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at Genesis 49:27, the prophecy of Jacob to Benjamin was, "Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil." So it's really not a very attractive prophecy.
No, that one's not.
Calling somebody a wolf.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we find here that there's a reason for that. And as we read on, he begins to talk about something that's going to happen in the consummation of ages. He will be in the synagogues of the Gentiles and among their rulers as a strain of music in the mouth of all. In other words, one of my descendants, I should say, in the far, far future, is going to enter the synagogues of the Gentiles, and he's going to be music to their ears, is basically what it says.
Mm-hmm. Take the gospel of grace about the Messiah and that other covenant, take it from the Jews into the synagogue of the Gentiles and amongst their writings. So Paul was a Benjamite. How many writings do we have of Paul in our New Covenant, in our New Testament?
We have 13 epistles.
Yeah, so prophecy fulfilled.
Prophecy fulfilled. And maybe the book of Hebrews. I personally believe Hebrews was written by Paul.
That's what the early church fathers said.
You know, in the August 2017 issue of the Prophecy Watcher, our magazine, my cover article was "The Prophecy of the Wolf." And before I had read the testimony of Benjamin, I read about the two Sauls, the Old Testament Saul of Kish and the New Testament Saul of Tarsus. Mm-hmm. And they both behaved as ravening wolves until God got a hold of the heart of the Saul in the New Testament, changed his name to Paul, and he began to preach the gospel exactly as prophesied right here in this testament of Benjamin. And that made an impression on me. That was so powerful. But it was only one of many similar impressions as I read through this book. I have never read these testimonies before. Mm-hmm. And they are moving. That's all I can say. It's just amazing what Ken has found here.
They are amazing. The fact that they would even be around. Like I say, the Talmud will mention the legend of these writings, but say that we don't know what happened to them, we don't have them. Then you go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there they are.
Yeah. The Dead Sea Scrolls, and by the way, we should mention a couple of things. You have given the catalog numbers of each of these, which scroll they came from, and,
right,
and so forth. And you've also assembled them in the book, and so that each of your chapters is concluded with a commentary. And for example, the commentary at the end of this one, Benjamin 3 predicts that the Messiah would be sinless and bring salvation to the whole world by being put to death by godless men. And Benjamin 11 describes the Apostle Paul and his written works. So you have a commentary on what each of these testimonies has said, and then at the end of the book you wrap it all up by putting these commentaries into a sequential order.
Right.
And believe it or not, there is a prophetic message here that's just incredibly powerful.
Oh, amazingly so. And
I mean, amazingly.
to know that it's 150 BC, and they were extremely accurate in all the things, including things mentioned in the New Testament that aren't thought of as prophecies, like the veil in the temple being ripped in two. So if they were all accurate on these, and then there's a few end-time prophecies, and the details for how the history formed and how the Sadducees and the Essenes formed and why, I would assume those would be accurate too. And that really helps explain a lot of things in the New Testament.
Now, again, let's talk about some of your favorite parts when you put this together. I mean, there are so many testimonies here. I'm looking at Zebulun and Naphtali and Asher, and I'm looking at all the tribes. I found Joseph very interesting because of his life and the things that happened to him in Egypt, and then coming out of Israel from Egypt. And Joseph played a huge key role, and yet when you read this, I got to call it a letter from Joseph. It's like reading a letter that was written yesterday. And he talks about some of the bad emotional experiences he had in Egypt.
Yes.
Let's talk about those a minute.
Yeah, they're amazing. I focus mainly on the prophecies, but some of those other things are pretty amazing too, like the arguments between Rachel and Leah. And it shows you how arguing in front of kids can really mess up kids. And so you can there's lots of moral points in there and things
Now,
that
when you're talking about arguing, you mean arguing.
I mean arguing.
Really
Yeah, some of the
serious.
some of the stuff that they, not cussing necessarily,
No.
but it's like a major argument. The two parents in front of a child, how that can cause a problem. So you see all sorts of things like that in there. But what I thought was fascinating is if you talk to a Jew today that goes by the Talmud, they would say we accept Messiah as a king, but he's not God incarnate or anything
Right.
supernatural like that.
Yes.
Well, the Essenes believed the patriarchs, and their doctrines all the way through the Dead Sea Scrolls make it very clear they accepted Jesus or the Messiah as being Yahweh incarnate. So just out of these patriarchs, for instance, the idea that the Messiah is God incarnate is in chapter 6 of Simeon, chapter 7 of Simeon, chapter 9 of Zebulun, chapter 8 of Naphtali, chapter 7 of Asher, chapter 10 of Benjamin. You know, and even what I thought was amazing, even the testament of Aaron, that'd be Moses' brother. Aaron actually said that the descendants of Levi would turn on the Messiah and crucify him or put him to death. And he gave a warning, if you wanted to be in God's grace, have nothing to do with the nails. That's the exact quote. Now we're missing a lot of that, so we don't know what the rest of the story was. But that's enough for you to get the idea consistently through these things. The Messiah comes and dies for our sins. The date which he would come and do that is mentioned or prophesied. The result is an age of grace, you know, and the different jubilee systems and the different ages, and there's a lot of other prophecies in there too. But it's just amazing how many of those things are actually in there.
Well, let's just look at Benjamin for a minute. And this is in the section 10 called the inheritance. It says, the Lord will judge Israel first, even for the wrong they did unto him, for when he appeared as a deliverer, God in the flesh, they did not believe him. Well, that's written by Benjamin.
And it's interesting, when ways back, we talked about the book of Gad the seer and some of the fragments of Nathan. They make it clear that David believed that the Messiah would be Yahweh incarnate. And so it's very consistent, all these things that are Dead Sea Scrolls. So the theology is consistent. The current Jewish system of the Talmud got off because they rejected Messiah. And the Christians are simply Gentiles that accept Dead Sea Scroll theology. It's all the same. They believed in Messiah through grace, through faith, and they awaited him, and we look back at him.
And again, and I have to stress this, when you read the testaments, the ancient testaments of the patriarchs that Ken Johnson has put together, you will open the book and you'll think, well, this is going to be pretty much like every other Christian book I've ever read. It's heartrending. That's the only way I know to describe this book. It's like reading somebody's private mail.
That really makes you think that it is real, that it's not just what the Essenes believe, but these are actual autobiographies from the patriarchs, because it's what's really important to you, the prophecies, plus one of the prophecies says you're going to go astray, don't do it, stay away from alcohol, stay away from this, stay away from pride. This is my experience in it. And some of the stories are extremely personal, but it gets the point across.
They are, and they make points like, stay away from alcohol. It could have been written yesterday. Literally advice to the kids. But how many thousand years ago did they actually put pen to papyrus?
Yeah, quite a bit. One of my favorite parts as far as the moral lessons was Judah, because he had his 3 sons, remember, and his sons died for not following directions. And he tells the story a little more detail. They were influenced by their mother, who was a Canaanite, and she wanted them to go Canaanite ways. And that's what caused the problems. And at one point in there, he said that just because she was cute and she was the daughter of a king and that might be good financial, and man, that was a mistake. I wish I would have never married her. And that tells us, I mean, you want to marry a godly woman, not somebody that's cute or not somebody that has money. Godliness is the most important thing.
And what's true then is true now.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. You know, on page 155, and I'm not going to read very much of this, that would be giving it away. But I want to tantalize you with what's at the end of the book. Because you have assembled the various prophecies uttered by these patriarchs at various points as they write. They'll occasionally make little statements, sometimes 3 words long, sometimes a couple of sentences, and that illuminate the last days. In other words, they're talking about prophecy. And aren't we interested in prophecy? Yes, we are.
Definitely.
And so here on page 155, you have put together like a little compendium of all the prophecies uttered by the patriarchs. And one says Messiah is the Son of God, and you have the location of this mentioned. Another one says, I'm just going to go down through, Messiah dies for us is one of the prophecies. Messiah resurrects. And as you read through these, and again, I want you to have the experience of reading the entire book before you come to this conclusive prophetic outline. As you read these, suddenly prophecy takes on a new dimension. It's not like a study in facts and figures and history. It begins to come alive.
Yeah, God moving amongst people.
Right. Yeah. It's very personal. And also makes you think we must be very, very close to the culmination of something. Because what they're talking about is what we're seeing right now.
Right.
And let's talk about Israel. They talked about, the patriarchs all had a vision of what was going to happen to Israel.
Right.
And so let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, the patriarchs, including Enoch from the book of Enoch and all the old other ones, talked about Israel coming into the land. They would eventually build a temple. There would be sacrifices. Levi talked about how God appeared to him in a vision and told him that he would be a priest, and there would be this new type of priesthood that would exist until the Messiah would come, and then he would create a Melchizedekian priesthood, and how things would work. And again, just the ages and the jubilees let us know that something's around the corner today.
Because, how do we know that?
Well, if they're that accurate in all these things, and again, if this is written 100 to 150 BC, and it's identical with the things that the New Testament records actually happened, they had to have been real prophets or had the gift of prophecy, of which including Josephus says. So if they're accurate in all these other things, and then there's just a handful of second coming prophecies, we would assume those would be accurate too. Again, if it's Dead Sea Scrolls written 150 BC, no Christian has reinterpreted it.
Now, we have the mention, this is fascinating to me, in one of these scrolls of the New Jerusalem.
Yes.
Now, we think of the New Jerusalem at the end of the book of Revelation.
And the description is identical.
The description of the New Jerusalem is found in the testimony of the patriarchs. That's astounding.
That's not to say that John copied it. You know,
Right.
John had a dream from the Lord, and it's written in the book of Revelation. That's what his dream is. But others have, and there's other Dead Sea Scrolls that talk about what the New Jerusalem looks like. And again, the descriptions are the same. It's pretty amazing.
All of this goes to validating Scripture.
Right.
And in every case, when you read these testimonies, they add solidarity. They add there's a human component, if you will, sort of the beating heart of the Bible is found in these testimonies. Where you read the Bible, you tend to read it academically, historically, grammatically. You read this, and it's wow. You get out the hanky because you're going to be dabbing away at tears. And I'm serious. It's amazing. By the way, we have the Ancient Testaments of the Patriarchs in our online bookstore. Go to prophecywatchers.com and click the online bookstore. Go down to Ken Johnson and you'll find a lot of books. Top of the mark is this one. I described this earlier today as the cherry on top of the ice cream sundae. This puts all of your other books together for me. And it's a wonderful read, and for a gift of $20, free shipping in the United States. You can have the Ancient Testaments of the Patriarchs. If you want to read some of Ken's other books, we've put together a package, as we often do, including Ancient Testaments of the Patriarchs, and that would be 6 books in all for your gift of $75. We have one on the ancient book of Enoch, the ancient book of Jubilees. We have one on the end times, written by the ancient church fathers. We have the book of Gad the seer. Who's Gad the seer? You need to read the book. Ancient apocalypse of Ezra. Ken has a gift for digging around in stale manuscripts and coming up with gems. I got to tell you, it's wonderful. So let's talk about what do you think is going to be the effect that this book has as it's out there in the public? Because I told my wife when I read this book, this thing is going to have an effect on Christian readers.
Well, Paul said eventually all Israel will be saved. And I've for years talked about when we witness to Jews, ask them about, well, the Messiah was supposed to come before Titus destroyed the temple in Daniel 9. So how do you get around the fact the Messiah had to have come? Well, there's a few excuses for that and a reinterpretation of a virgin birth. But when you start looking at these Dead Sea Scrolls, that's not the interpretation that's always been. The Jews always believed that that was the Messiah. So now with these new scrolls, how in the world can you not accept Jesus as the Messiah or Yeshua as the Messiah?
Now, the Jews believed, you say, and yet Christ was crucified.
Mm-hmm.
What happened?
The prophecies were pretty specific in there. The Jews fragmented into the 3 different pieces, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And the ones that controlled the temple became perverted and did not recognize or follow Messiah when he came and had him put to death. And that's what they were looking for, as what the Essene prophecies said.
This really illuminates our New Testament. You know, when Jesus came to Jerusalem, overturned the tables of the money changers, constantly debating with the Pharisees and Sadducees. Mm-hmm. And when you read the Ancient Testaments of Patriarchs, it adds flesh and blood to that whole conflict that came to the fore when Jesus arrived.
Yeah, you learn the origin of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, and it makes a lot more sense.
A lot more sense. Ken, I got to say thanks for writing this book, Ancient Testaments of the Patriarchs. Believe me, you will be glad you read this one. I'm Gary Stearman. Hey, keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.